On this episode of the Second Act Backpacking Podcast, we are talking about backpacker origin stories. Everyone's got one. And if you're getting into it later in life, your origin story may have some regret. I know mine does. Let's get into it. This is the Second Act Backpacking Podcast. Whether you're starting later, getting back into it, or just looking to spend some more time outside, we share real experiences, lessons learned, and everything that comes with it to help you hit the trail with confidence. Welcome to another episode of Second Act Backpacking, the podcast for folks getting into or back into backpacking later in life, and for the old school heads who never got off the trail and didn't think it was weird at all that one day we were wearing boots and the next day we were wearing trail runners. And I hope that you can hear a better audio quality. I'm actually back at home, unfortunately not on the trail, but at least I'm not having to record using AirPods. I will say that I have had some issues getting things running early enough in previous recordings for portions of this episode. So you may hear some audio jumping back and forth. I'll try to fix that, but at least it doesn't sound like I'm talking through a potato. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to everybody who was sending emails and comments and things like that through the website about last week's episode of Trail Fails. I'm glad to know that I'm not the only one who has forgotten things like toilet paper before they left on a day hike. So that makes me feel better. And while we're at the top of the episode, let me go ahead and point you to our website, backpackingover40.com. That's backpackingover40.com. We keep our podcast, our companion articles, gear reviews, all sorts of stuff over there for you to check out. You can reach us on a contact form there. You can also reach us secondactbackpacking@gmail.com is our official email address. And we also have our Instagram and YouTube, and both of those are at Second Act Backpacking. So just throw those out there so you can reach out to us if you have questions or comments or stories of your own. So today's episode I thought was kind of cool to continue along what we were talking about last week, which is kind of like regrets. I thought it would be interesting to talk about origin stories, kind of like the Marvel or DC comic books. Everybody's got origin stories. My kids love those movies, so I'm always hearing about different origin stories, and every backpacker has one. And for me, mine actually is kind of interesting because I talk a lot about backpacking versus through hiking on this channel. But my origin story actually comes from the standpoint of a through hiker. So let's talk a little bit about that. Backpacking for me started as part of being in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. It was primarily where I was introduced to both of those things. However, there's a big difference in that kind of activity because it's very much adult directed. You're just a participant and you kind of learn as you go, which is great as a young person. I know a lot of people didn't have that experience, so it was good for me to kind of get that experience and kind of slowly build into it because it did build a lifelong love for the outdoors. But specifically as it related to backpacking in the scouts, the first thing that really drove me or pulled me towards backpacking was a presentation that we got as about 12 years old at a scout camp where they were talking about long distance backpacking from the perspective of a through hike of the Appalachian Trail and talking about the differences between regular backpacking and long distance backpacking and those types of things. That was what really drove me to wanting to focus more on backpacking. And I stayed in scouts up until the time I was about 14. We eventually moved, but what I found was that it just amazed me that this 2,100-mile trail exists and that it's out there and it's just it's there for you to use, and that just blew my mind. And I remember being around 12 years old, our house was about a mile from a library, and my parents, this was the early 90s, were fine with me riding my bike and basically disappearing until the streetlights came on. So I went to the library and used my library card to check out a few books on the Appalachian Trail, brought them home, read them cover to cover almost immediately, and I was hooked. I thought the Appalachian Trail is the most amazing, awesome thing that I have ever heard of, and I want to hike this Appalachian Trail. I want to backpack this in Appalachian Trail. So I kept reading and learning, and as I was given the opportunity to go on backpacking trips with scouting, I always had the Appalachian Trail in the back of my mind. And as even after I left scouting, this still stayed kind of a focal point in my brain for a period of time. I really enjoyed the idea of being able to go out and do this through hike. Just something about it appealed to me. And I was so hooked and so focused on it that we went on a trip with our church group to the Linville Gorge wilderness area, and it was very rugged. And people who from North Carolina probably know that now the Mountains to the Sea Trail runs through the Linville Gorge wilderness area, so you may have more familiarity with it. But it was kind of really rugged backcountry. The first time I'd ever been there, and we did a couple days there with this church group, and it was just amazing to me. And I came home at 15 just adamant that I wanted to backpack as much as possible, and I wanted to do the Appalachian Trail, and it was what I wanted. And fast forward about a year, I am reading an insane amount of literature. I'm looking at all of the trail maps. I'm doing all the things like this is what I want to do. This is my goal. And it catches the attention of my mother, who was always very supportive of the things that I wanted to do and things that gave me joy. So she noticed it and said that she was interested in learning more about it. So I started telling her all about it, explaining it to her, and she said, "Well, that's a really interesting thing. You should, keep working towards that." So I remember vividly going in and mapping out drop points, dates and times, distances, things like that. So after some time went by and I had everything mapped out and everything was just kind of getting dialed in, I was barely 16, had just started driving, and my mother was asking for more information about it. And I was telling her what I had planned out and how it was looking for me and what I wanted to do. And she said to me, "Oh, well, this might be a really cool thing for you to do after you graduate high school." Now, I will say up front, I was not the best student. I now know that I have ADHD and autism. So that created some learning difficulties that nobody really knew about back in the mid 90s. But the thing that I remember very specifically was that she asked me for numbers for cost of how much it was going to be for me to do this, and I gave her the numbers that I had at the time, and she said, "Well, that seems pretty doable. If you save some money now, you should be able to do that, but I feel like we could give you the rest at graduation and help you and let you do that." So I thought that that was a really cool idea. And a couple of months later, my mom said, "Hey, let's talk to your father about that when he gets home from work about the possibility of doing this as a graduation present for you. And you can start working on that." And I said, "That was great." Well, he came home from work and she was out on the porch and she said, "Hey, come here." And she had me explain it to my father, the through hiking aspects of the Appalachian Trail and how everything worked and what was going to happen and what it would be like. And she looked at him and said, "This is something I think we could give him as a graduation present if he graduates from high school." And pretty much in less than a half a second, he straight faced just looked and said, "No, we're not doing that." And just kind of got up and walked in the house. And that was kind of the end of the conversation. So it was a very strange kind of vibe, I guess. I remember kind of thinking, "What the hell just happened?" But that was it. It was never spoken of again. My mom just kind of gave me a look and shook her head and got up and walked inside, and that was the last we ever talked about it. And it did take the wind out of my sails. I still wanted to go, but again, I was not the greatest student and I continued to have academic struggles throughout high school, such that I ended up graduating 6 months late because I failed a class senior year and I had to retake that class. So that was a problem that I bumped into, which again, it's my own fault, but it was one of those things. I was also working full time, and I also got in with a crowd who wasn't really into the outdoors. And when you're an 18-year-old kid, you kind of think you got to do what other people are doing, and the other people around me weren't engaging in any of that kind of activity. And I would still go do day hikes by myself because I enjoyed day hiking. And finally, I decided after I graduated high school that I wanted to at least start doing some more backpacking. So I started buying some equipment, but I hadn't really done a lot since I had been away from church groups and friend groups that did it. So I started buying the equipment to do solo backpacking. And I'm going to do an episode on packing your fears, which is exactly what I did the first time I went solo backpacking. I think it's a great lesson for people to learn. But what I talked about in last week's episode about the carrying the 50 plus pound pack and being miserable, that again took the wind out of my sails. And it was a few months after that before I went out and did any more backpacking. I really had to figure out how to cut weight. And even then, I think I cut maybe 11 or 12 pounds. I was still in the high 30s, but I mean, it was a change before I went out again. But at 19 years old, when I'm out backpacking, I have yet to step foot on the Appalachian Trail. This thing that we really wanted my entire childhood to do, I still hadn't even stepped foot on this trail. And it was kind of something that just seemed out of reach at that point because I was working full time and I was trying to go to school. And then I was just being a 19-year-old stupid kid and not really thinking that far into the future. Now, I will be the first to admit that there are people who are driven and dedicated and who do this every single year. When they graduate high school or graduate college, they get out there and they hit one of these trails and they do the through hike. But for me, it just wasn't happening that way. I felt like it was a bit too much to undertake, and at that point, I was working full time and didn't really have time off or PTO or any of that kind of stuff, so it created, problems as well. And within a couple of years, I still hadn't been on the Appalachian Trail. I hadn't even been near it at that point. I had done some day hiking and a few short backpacking trips and a decent amount of camping. But then I'm married and my first child arrives just like that. It just happened. I don't know how it happened looking back on it, but it just happened. And when you have a child and you're married and you are trying to take care of a child and raise a child and pay the bills, backpacking becomes a secondary concern. I stayed dedicated to getting out by myself, solo day hiking, but I backpacking kind of went off the table because when you have a young child, being away for 3 or 4 days is not something that you can really do. And then before too long, those months turned into years, and those years turned into a decade or more. And then now I have another young child and then another young child. So it creates a lot of barriers. Now, I say barriers, and maybe some people will think that's negative. That's not negative. The best things that have ever happened to me in my life have been my kids, but the logistics of trying to be through hiking, section hiking, or doing anything like that when you have 3, 5, 7, 10-year-old kids at home just doesn't really work. And when you have three of them, I'm just going to go ahead and dispel any notions for folks. If you have three of them, the chances that all three of them will be okay with backpacking and being in the backcountry with you are pretty much zero. I remember when we took them on our day hiking trips and then we took our long distance trips out west, we found that it was very difficult to keep all three of them motivated during the day. We always had one who was lagging behind or was miserable or who hated life or who just wanted to go to a hotel or something like that. So there's no way that I'm going to get three of them and my wife on the Appalachian Trail or any major trail to do backpacking. It's just not possible. And that's nothing wrong with that. I don't want my kids to do things because mom and dad make them. I want them to do things because they enjoy them and get fulfillment out of them. And if my kids aren't outdoorsy, then that's great. I'm happy to say that I have an 18-year-old who I thought was never really going to be into the outdoors much at all, now saying that she likes going hiking with her boyfriend and she likes going out and seeing nature, which is awesome for me as a parent who loves the outdoors that I've been able to pass something like that along to my kids. But I will say that even for all of the amazing benefits that my children have given to my life and all the enrichment I've got out of them, somewhere in my head was this understanding that there was something missing. There was something that I wanted to do that I couldn't do. But you put those things to the side because your kids become the priority of your life, and it's perfectly acceptable for you to hold space for things that you enjoy doing. But if one of the things that you really want to do is disappear for 5 months to accomplish some goal of through hiking, I don't know that I wouldn't feel like I was being selfish in that situation. I'm not throwing shade on anyone who might feel differently. I will say that for me personally, that's the way I would feel, and I wouldn't be able to enjoy the experience feeling that way. But one of the things that happens is that as your kids get older, things start to change. They're more responsible, they start driving, they start getting jobs. They can kind of take care of themselves a little bit more, and your focus can kind of start to change. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is maybe something that you don't necessarily notice until it's kind of starting to hit you. It didn't really hit me until my oldest was actually moving out to go to grad school. That wow, she's actually moving out. That means that she's an adult and she's taking care of herself. And then my middle child, they played travel soccer for most of their youth, and then their senior year of high school, they decided, hey, I don't want to play travel anymore. I'm just going to play for the school senior year. And now what used to be an entire fall season spent going from town to town and state to state to play travel soccer is now available to you. And you're thinking to yourself, what am I going to do with this time that I now have? And your attention can kind of start to drift to other things. And that's kind of what it did for me. I had the opportunity to start getting out and doing more stuff than I used to be able to do. However, one of the big factors is that even as this started to be the case, even as I was given more free time and it wasn't so necessary for me to be at home, I still had not gotten out to touch or even go near this trail that had kind of consumed so much of my childhood. And it started to weigh on me a little bit. So around 2024, I decided that I wanted to start doing some sections of the Appalachian Trail. And I started doing some more research, delving into it a little bit more. I was starting to do some more backpacking at that point, albeit short trips. And I started focusing more on the content of what was going in my pack from a through hiking perspective and making sure that it was the right thing for that rather than just casual backpacking. And I said, I'm going to go do a week on the trail. I'm going to do a week. It's a section hike. I'll be back in a week. It'll be great. I'll just do a holiday long weekend thing. And I even went so far as registering my trip and my dates early in 2024. And as luck would have it, call it life getting in the way. About a month before that, I was contacted by work saying, "Hey, we really need you to do these 3 or 4 things, and this is the time we need them done." And it fell right when I was supposed to take my trip. And I could have said no, but it was kind of a new job and I didn't want to do that. Folks, if you've been doing this any length of time, you know that there are certain things you can't or shouldn't say no to if you want things to continue working in your favor, so to speak. So for me, it was something I just had to say, all right, I'm not going to do it. And I said, I'll do it next year. I will do it next year. And so 2025 came and we were pretty hectic there. And again, it's a milestone year, rising senior. We have all these different things going on, and it didn't happen again. I was able to get out on a few overnight trips and weekend trip, but nothing in the space of what I had kind of been setting out to do my entire life, what I had been journaling about, what I had been planning for. It just wasn't coming together. And I gotta be honest, I started to have some regret and I started to get frustrated. And then I started to get angry with myself because I letting myself down? What am I doing here? And I I was kind of taken aback by that feeling because this is something I've wanted to do for a long time, but I never really asked myself, why did I want to do this? And the more I thought about it, the idea of being on the Appalachian Trail and the idea of hiking the whole thing from beginning to end, it makes sense to me from one standpoint, but not from another standpoint. And I break it down like this: from the standpoint of being a person who wants to accomplish some monumental goal, it makes sense. But is the purpose of doing it about being on the trail, or is the purpose about completing it so that you can say you did it? And a couple of weeks ago, I threw a quote out from a person that I've heard before. And the quote is that you should climb the mountain so that you can see the world, not so that the world can see you. And I thought about that when I was thinking about, should I feel bad about not being out on the Appalachian Trail when I'm approaching 50, when I've wanted to do it since I was, 12 or 13 years old? And I decided I'm not going to feel bad about it. It is not about accomplishing it in a certain period of time or by the time I am this age or whatever. It's about the journey itself. So instead of setting a goal where I was going to do X number of miles of the Appalachian Trail this year or next year or this or that, for 2026, I set a goal, and that goal was just to go to the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. That's it. I just wanted to get there. It didn't matter how far I went once I got there, I just wanted to get there. And I felt like that was achievable because we live about 4.5 to 5 hours away from there, and we could very easily go out there for a weekend trip. Again, the benefit of having older kids is that they are capable of staying at home without you needing to be there, as long as you trust your kids are not gonna throw wild parties. And I talked to my wife and I said, "Hey, we'll do it, in the fall sometime when it's not so hot. We'll do it in the fall." And we were kinda talking about it. And sure enough, things started bumping into it. Work's got a trip scheduled for this. Well, I have to go to this state for Harry. She has a work trip. The kids have this going on. There's that going on. School starts back here. And I started to feel a little bit of the frustrations that I'd felt in the past. Like, here I am setting this goal to accomplish this thing that is part of what I wanted to do, and I'm not going to be able to do it because stuff's coming up again, and I don't want to feel like I'm being selfish or self-centered by demanding that I get to go do this thing that's kind of a recreational activity. And I was starting to feel frustrated, and then just out of nowhere, work says, "Hey, I need you to go here. We need you to spend some time here doing some work with these folks. And here's where it is, and here's what we need you to do." And I just happened to look and I said, "Wow, that's pretty far out west in North Carolina. That's interesting. Okay." And I just happened to remember seeing that the route took me through the Nantahala National Forest. And I said, "Wait, that crosses through the Appalachian Trail. That is awesome. So I'll be close by. That's cool." And so I went there for an overnight, and when I was on my way back, I had to sure enough pass by the Nantahala Outdoor Center. And I know that the trail crosses right there, so I'm just coming down through there, and I happen to see on the Google Maps a little blip for the Appalachian Trail. I said, "Hey, that's where the Appalachian Trail crosses." So I got to the Nantahala Outdoor Center. I just pulled off the side of the road on a side road right there, and I found where the trail comes out of the woods, and I walked over and just walked maybe 100 feet up the trail, and I came back down because my car was double parked. I couldn't be there long, but I accomplished the goal of stepping foot on the Appalachian Trail. Silly as it may be, it filled me with like this feeling that I really can't describe, of just like accomplishment, but I didn't really even accomplish anything. So I thought to myself, wow, if I ever get a chance to come back and do this again, I might actually, just bring a day pack or something. Well, no sooner than I had made it home, I get a call from my boss saying, "Hey, how did things go?" And I gave him an update, and he said, "Is there any way you could go out there next week for a couple of days?" And I said, "Absolutely, I can." And I went and spoke to my wife, and I said, "Hey, is this something that you might want to come with me for? We could actually make kind of a short vacation out of it." And she said, "Absolutely." So we went back, and we were in the same area, and I just happened to be in this office where I'm helping these folks, and I just happened to pull up Google Maps, and I happened to see on Google Maps the Springer Mountain listed, and I was like, "Wow!" So I hit the pin, and it was about an hour and 15 minutes away from where I was sitting, and I was like, "That is so cool." And then I started looking at it, and I realized that, wait a second, there's a small parking area about a mile from Springer Mountain that is off of a Forest Service road. And I looked at that, and I kind of planned with it in my head, and I said, "Oh, that's really cool." So I went to my wife that evening and I said, "Hey, would you be interested at all with going down here to this the Appalachian Trail? And I would just really like to go to the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. I'd like to go to Springer Mountain." And she was on board. She was, very much on board. And she likes hiking. She's not a backpacker per se yet. I think she might be starting to think about it as a cool option. But she said yes. So that Friday morning, we had the day off, or I had the day off, and we jumped in the car and we drove that hour and 15 minutes down there. And it's 6.5 miles up a Forest Service road. And if you've ever been up a Forest Service road, that's not a great option, but we made it. And all I had with me was just some random pieces of kit. I hadn't brought any of my day hiking stuff. I hadn't planned to do this trip, but I said, I'm an hour away from this thing I've wanted to see since I was 13. I'm going to jump on it. Let's make it happen. And we pieced some stuff together. So we had enough stuff to be safe, and we hit the trail. And it was about an hour of hiking because we took a lot of time to stop and kind of experience all of the stuff. My wife loves mushrooms and slugs and bugs and things like that, and looking at plants and seeing unique species and stuff. So we took our time getting up there. And what I really noticed about that was part of my brain was screaming like, we got to get to the top, we got to get to the top, but the other part of my brain was saying, hey, it's not about completing this, it's about enjoying your time. So just let's just do this. And we had a lot of fun doing that, and we ended up getting to the top and hanging out and taking pictures and just experiencing it. And I got to the top and I was able to take pictures of the bronze plaques on Springer Mountain. And my wife took pictures of me up there, and we had this magical time. And then we slowly made our way back down to the parking area. And so, on a whim, this thing that I've wanted to do for 33 years is now well underway because I gave myself the opportunity to just be flexible and focus more on the journey than the destination, and focus more about experiencing it rather than getting it done. So that is a major milestone checked off for me. And it has really invigorated me to want to get out there and do some more, but not focus on how quickly I can get it done, or getting it done by a certain birth date or something like that. It gets me out there wanting to enjoy my time in the backcountry and really get as much of an experience out of it as possible instead of just trying to trudge through to accomplish it. And I think that that's something that I see more now because of my age. So now I'm actually thankful that things happen the way they did. And I am at this age in my late 40s rather than in my teens, because I know me in my teens, I would have 100% focused on getting as many miles done. And I would have literally just kept my face directed straight down the trail and not looked side to side and not seen any of the amazing things. So, as we close out this episode, I just wanted to say that it's important to keep in mind that everyone that you're on the trail with, whether they're part of your group or just a complete stranger, has an origin story. And the older you get, the more likely that origin story is going to have some type of built in regret or wishing or things that you wish you had done differently. And I want to remind people that it's important that you focus on the positives and not the negatives, and that you spend the time in the outdoors learning and growing and being out there for the opportunities that it gives you, not to just check things off of your list as a requirement or something that you've got to get done. I feel like the biggest takeaway for me was that understanding that it's okay to stop and smell the roses and take your time, and that it's perfectly okay to be slow and deliberate about your progress so that way you enjoy it along the way. So, thanks for tuning in to another episode. On the next episode, we're going to be talking about packing your fears and some of the things I've learned over my years and especially that first epic failure of a trip I had when I was 19. In the meantime, check out our website, backpackingover40.com. That's backpackingover40.com. We have our companion articles, gear reviews, and other information. If you've tried being there in the past couple of days, you may have noticed that the website was down, and that's completely my fault. Being in the field, I wasn't getting my alerts for our uptime for our servers, but that's been fixed. Feel free to reach out to us on that website. Also, Second Act Backpacking on YouTube and Instagram. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, keep building confidence, and we'll see you out there. Thanks for listening to the Second Act Backpacking Podcast. If you want more, be sure to subscribe. And you can always find us over at backpackingover40.com. That's backpackingover40.com. Until next time, we'll see you on the trail.